Lawmakers approved a special election, and Bruce Rauner prepares to take office. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues and WUIS. And with me today is Bob Gough, editor of the Quincy Journal. Bob, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jim.
And Charlie Wheeler, director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS. Charlie, glad to have you back.
Thank you, Jamey.
So, as we are taping the show on Thursday, the House just voted to approve a special election to fill the office of Comptroller. Charlie, can you catch us up on what's going on here? It's a little complicated. There have been a lot of ins and outs as far as appointments and whether the Constitution allows appointments to stand. Let people know what's going on with the Comptroller's office.
Well, basically, as I'm sure all our viewers know, Illinois suffered a great and tragic loss with the passing of Judy Bar-Topinka, who had been the Comptroller. She was reelected in November. She passed away, and that created a vacancy in the office. Now, the Constitution says that when a vacancy occurs in one of the other elected statewide offices, other than the lieutenant governor, the governor fills that vacancy. And the question was, for how long is that appointment to last? Originally, Governor Quinn said, well, perhaps this should be not only for the remainder of Comptroller Topinka's term, which was basically a matter of a month or so, maybe it should also be for the 4 years to which she was elected. A lot of people thought that was an improper reading of the Constitution, and me, practicing law without a license again, thought that he was reading it wrong too. The Attorney General came down and said, the vacancy that exists with the passing of Comptroller Topinka is for the governor to fill up until the time when that term expires. At that point, when it's time to swear in a new comptroller, the winner of the election, Judy Bar-Topinka, will not be available. The new governor, Bruce Rauner, who will be inaugurated maybe half an hour before the time for the comptroller, he will have the power to fill that vacancy. And so that was pretty much, I would say, everybody's understanding of what it was. And the question became, for how long does the person that Bruce Rauner is going to appoint, how long will that person serve? And the Republicans argued, well, it should be for the full 4 years. The Democrats argued, and Lisa Madigan, the Attorney General, in her opinion, suggested it would probably be better just to have that a 2-year appointment and then have a special election in 2016 to fill the remainder of Judy Bar-Topinka's term. And the rationale is that we basically elect our officials, and rather than have a 4-year appointment, it's better to have an appointment that just lasts until the next general election. And that's the provision, for example, with state senators. If there's a vacancy that occurs in a state senate term, when there's sufficient time, I think it's 28 months before the next election, then that vacancy only is until that next election.
And lawmakers today voted to do just that. Presumably Governor Quinn will sign the legislation because he has supported it. But Bob, being Illinois, there are politics involved here too. Can you tell us a little bit about the political side of this?
Well, I know that the Senate Minority Leader, Christine Radogno, had issues with it. She called it a naked power play. Matt Murphy also spoke out against it. As we put together this program, we haven't really heard what the governor-elect's had to say. My question, I guess, that I had is her appointment, now that it's 2 years and we'll have the special election in 2016, are we going to have another regular comptroller election then in 2018?
Yeah. That would be my reading on it, that it's just like with the state senate, the person is elected to fill the remainder of the term. And if you think about it, it makes sense because, as I said earlier, we kind of pride ourselves on electing a lot of people. As a matter of fact, the job that the comptroller does in some states, it's an appointed official. The governor appoints it. The governors in some state appoint an attorney general. Most of the work that our Secretary of State does with the viewers would be most familiar dealing with motor vehicles, driver's license plates. A lot of states have a division of motor vehicles that handles all that. But we like to elect people. So the rationale is that we shouldn't put someone in an appointed position for a full 4 years, but just until we have the opportunity to elect someone else.
Well, we do have more forms of government than anybody else in the country too. That's part of it.
Yeah.
But Jamey, one of the things that you and I had talked about also was, is this an opportunity to merge the offices now? That's something to think about too.
Yeah, the folks that have supported that in the past, it seems like there's a bigger spotlight shown on the Comptroller's office than maybe there has ever been. Charlie, do you think that will help bring some attention to this long-standing plan to merge the Comptroller and Treasurer's office?
I would say it all depends on what House Speaker Michael Madigan wants to do. And the reason that I say that, and this is kind of an aside, Comptroller Topinka had always been extraordinarily gracious with her time and was always willing to have my public affairs reporting students in for a news conference in the fall. And that was an issue that she would touch on, and she repeatedly would say, we just have to get Mike Madigan to go along with it. And as a matter of fact, at one time in the past, the Senate approved a proposed constitutional amendment to merge the offices, and the House actually approved one too. And if I recall correctly, the Senate was going to call it the Office of the Treasurer. The House was going to call it the Office of the Comptroller. And the reason was that at the time the Senate was in Republican hands and there was a Republican treasurer. The Democrats controlled the House. There was a Democratic Comptroller and they couldn't agree on the name. Somebody suggested, well, maybe we should have the Comptroller of the Treasury or the Treasury of the Comptroller or something like that. But yeah, it makes sense, I guess, in this day and age to merge the two offices. They cooperate very closely. Basically, the treasurer keeps track of the money. The comptroller writes the checks. And so they have to work very closely to make sure that when the comptroller writes the check, the treasurer has the money in the bank. And so it would be kind of logical to combine the two offices. Now, that could be a proposed amendment that would go before voters in 2016 and maybe take effect for the election in 2018.
And Bruce Rauner has named his choice for the next comptroller. Bob, can you tell us a little bit about the person that he chose? Someone who doesn't have a lot of political experience, more business experience. What does that tell us?
Well, I think you look at this, and Leslie Munger did run for state rep and lost that seat, but.
Relatively close.
Yeah, it was a pretty close election. But you're bringing in someone who has that type of, I guess, fiscal background that they were looking for. In looking at that, I know that a lot of people, some of the people who Tom Cross and Bob Grogan, they all complimented the choice. I mean, everybody who's on the Republican side, everybody sort of fell in line with this. And I know one of the popular parlor games was to guess who was going to get it, and there was a little speculation about Cross possibly getting it, but I guess he really didn't want it from what a lot of people had said. But I think when you look at this, and it is funny because she's talked about somebody, when you talk about public service and when you say things like, well, I really don't want a career in politics, but then you run for an office and then you get an appointment and then you say, I'm going to run for the re-election of that, some people are kind of hammering her over the head with it, but I mean, is that really a career in politics? I mean, is it a career in politics if you're like, hey, I'm going to go find an office, I'm going to serve 2 terms, I'm going to do my public service, and then I'm going to walk away from it. And, I guess it's when at this day and age when it's really in vogue to denigrate public service and denigrate those people who do it, especially when they're a long period of time, I still think there's room for people to say, hey, I'm just going to go in, do this for a term or 2, and get out. Now, there are a lot of people who say, I'm going to go do this, get in for a term or 2, get out, and don't get out. John Shimkus comes to mind. Yeah. But when I believe that there is some nobility in people who just say, I just want to go do my part for 6 or 8 years or so.
Yeah, and to me, another interesting thing is that we're having all this political infighting over an office that really doesn't amount to a hill of beans. And I probably should explain that. It's a very significant, important office in terms of what it does. But in the way political offices have been evaluated in Illinois over, as long as I've been watching this stuff, it really isn't very important. It doesn't have a lot of jobs. There's maybe 230 people work for the Comptroller. It doesn't have a huge budget for handing out contracts. The contracting line item in the budget for the Comptroller this year is roughly around $5 million. The budget itself is in the neighborhood of $110 million, but that's kind of deceptive because about $85 million of it is money that goes to the Comptroller to be passed out. The Comptroller is the one who is in charge of paying the salaries for all the statewide elected officials. She pays legislative per diem, or he or she, or I guess Ms. Munger would be still a she. The Comptroller has a $50 million line item to pay salaries for court reporters across the state. So it's not a position like the Secretary of State that has literally thousands upon thousands of jobs. It doesn't have a huge contracting budget, and it's not really a stepping stone to get anywhere else. I went back and I looked at the people who've been Comptroller. First Comptroller was George Lindbergh. He got beaten when he ran for re-election. He ultimately wound up as a U.S. judge. He's in senior status now in the Northern District, so he did okay. Mike Bacalus, who beat him, lost when he ran for governor. Roland Burris was elected Comptroller, elected Attorney General, but he lost for governor, he lost for U.S. Senate, he lost
be a senator
for
someday.
Chicago mayor. He wound up being senator when he was, this is going to be snarky, I know, but he was maybe the only guy in the state of Illinois who would accept an appointment from Rod Blagojevich to fill former Senator Barack Obama's position. Dawn Clark Netsch lost for governor. Lolita Didrikson lost a Republican primary for the U.S. Senate to Peter Fitzgerald, who ultimately became the U.S. Senator. Dan Hines lost for governor. So the track record of being Comptroller and trying to move up the food chain is pretty abysmal. So it's in the standard, what would you say, rating process for how important is this office in Illinois politics. It's really not. It does serve a vital function, and one of the things that Comptroller Topinka did, as many of her predecessors did, was to try and triage the state's bills. We always owe more than we have money, or in recent years we've owed more than we've had money on hand to pay, and it's been in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 billion of late. And so Comptroller Topinka would look at the bills as they came in, and she'd make a value judgment. Here's the social service agency. If we don't pay their bill right away, they're going to have to lay off people. Or here's this nursing home. If we don't pay their bill, they're not going to have money to buy food for the residents. On the other hand, here's this voucher to pay a categorical grant program to this suburban school. They can probably get by if they have to wait a little longer. Ideally, we shouldn't have to do that, but that's the way it goes, and it's been like that for recent years. Dan Hines had to do it. Dawn Clark Netsch had to do it. It's, I guess, the nature of the beast, and Topinka did it very well, and I'm assuming that Munger will do the same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that is such a key component of the job as the state is struggling with its fiscal situation, that she actually told the Chicago Tribune after the announcement that she did plan to carry on Topinka's emphasis on making sure that social service agencies get their payments so they don't have to close their doors. So that definitely seems to be a big part of the job at this point. So moving on, we're going to see inaugurations of a lot of folks next week, some folks that have been in office for a long time, some folks that are new to office. Charlie, can you tell us a little bit about what we can expect out of the inauguration week? Bruce Rauner is shaking things up a little bit, doing things a little bit different. What are you looking forward to, and what do you expect to see?
Well, I'm not one for all the pomp and circumstance, so the fact that we're not going to have an inaugural ball, I'm shedding no tears. I'm not going to go to the concert either. If I'm not mistaken, there's some athletic event going on that evening that I think might compete for attention. But what I'm really looking forward to hear is what the governor-elect will say in his inaugural address. For more than a year, for as long as he's been campaigning, Bruce Rauner has kind of sketched out in vague terms, here's what I want to do, details later. Details will come at the appropriate time. We'll have more for you that in a little bit. Oh, we'll be ready for that later. Well, later is finally here, and I'm hoping that he gets into some specifics about what is his vision for Illinois and how is he going to bring it about. I guess he's done the vision thing, but how are you going to accomplish this? And I'm hoping that the other constitutional officers will be supportive of him and of his efforts. And there's going to be an interesting, what would you say, dysfunction, not dysfunction is not the right, but there's going to be a time lag in that the executive officers get sworn in on Monday. And so for the rest of the day on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday until noon, it'll be the 98th General Assembly, the old crew of General Assembly members. And then at noon on Wednesday, the new General Assembly will be sworn in. The new General Assembly will be mostly the old General Assembly back again. The leadership will not change. Yeah. But it'll be a new dynamic because the Democrats in the General Assembly with their supermajorities will be dealing with a Republican governor for the first time in a dozen years. Now, based on past history, Democratic General Assemblies, Republican governors have always managed to sit down, put aside the partisan differences and say, here are the problems, how do we solve them? What do we do? And what do you need for your people to be with me? What do I need for my people to be part of it? And they work out partisan agreements that generally have allowed the state to move forward. And I'm hopeful that this will be the case going forward.
Well, and Bob, the Rauner camp has told us to expect some key appointments over the weekend leading up to the inauguration. What are folks saying about, everyone's speculating, of course, but what are folks saying about that?
I mean, he's kind of doing a little a statewide tour over Friday and Saturday to kind of get, back to where a lot of, going to a lot of places where he had success all over the state, so he's going to a lot of those places. And I think he's probably going to go to some places where maybe some, he'll have some appointments, will maybe be there. I think that would make sense. He's coming to Quincy, so who knows? But he's noon Quincy on Saturday, so as we tape this, we're not sure. But he's also got other appointments all over the state. I think that he will certainly he'll have at least one department head, agency head, what have you, who will be a Democrat. I don't want to say token Democrat, but he will. He might have more than one then, and it wouldn't be that case. But I think you're going to see that. I think that's the sort of thing he's going to look at, especially when you look at his first appointment was very telling. It's not like Ms. Munger comes across as a conservative firebrand. They talked about her bio, and she certainly said she supported a woman's right to choose. Which, of course, you've still got people who you've still got a conservative element out there who doesn't want to hear that from anybody. But last time I checked, I don't think the Comptroller has anything to do with Roe v. Wade. So, you look at this and, some of the other positions, it's going to be real interesting to see, who he goes with. He's talked about shaking up Springfield. Do you shake up Springfield if you bring in a bunch of people who've already been in Springfield? Are appointing past, former lawmakers to such positions, is that really doing that? Or are you going to see a bunch of new faces? I think we'll see a little bit of both.
Yeah, and I think his office has hinted that there'll be a combination, as you say. There'll be some new faces, some people from outside Illinois, but there'll also be some old hands with some institutional knowledge and know how government functions. And I think that's important. I think you need a mix. I don't think you come in and bring in entirely new people with no background or knowledge about Illinois government and politics, because they inevitably will walk into all kinds of minefields that someone with little experience would be able to avoid. I recall, this was, years and years ago, when Jim Egger first ran for governor to succeed Jim Thompson. One of Egger's pledges was, I'm going to fire all of Thompson's department directors, not bring any of them back. Well, it just so happened at the time, the person who was the director of the Department of Children and Family Services got national plaudits for being very, very excellent at the job. But Edgar, true to his pledge, let that person go. And at the time, I thought, this is really a mistake. You shouldn't make blanket pledges like that. You should evaluate everybody on their merits. And it could very well be that there are people working for state government now who are doing a very excellent job, whose commitment isn't to R's or D's, but to the agency for which they work. And I think if I were in his position, it would be very smart to retain those people who have the institutional knowledge, who already know the background and can help you move forward and don't have a learning curve that's going to take the next 6 months.
Well, and while we're talking about politics, and not to dwell too much on the special election or the Comptroller's office, I do want to see what both of you think. Folks have been kind of speculating out there that this is sort of the first conflict between Speaker Madigan and Bruce Rauner, that Speaker Madigan has tried pretty hard not to do anything publicly, to offend Rauner or to contradict him until this point. Are people making too much of this, or do you think that this really was a sign that Madigan, is changing course with Rauner?
I don't think it's a sign that Madigan is trying to slap Rauner in the face, as some of the heated rhetoric suggested in the House today. I think if you look at it, politics aside, which is always difficult in Illinois, it's kind of correcting an oversight that some point in the last 40 years the General Assembly should have taken care of. Because there are, I don't know, probably a dozen or more places in the Constitution where it says this is the way it is, and then it adds as provided by law. This is one of those instances. And the legislature, right after the Constitution was ratified, the legislature spent much of the next session going through, filling in all those blanks. And this is one they overlooked. Had they been doing this, say, 10 years ago, and the question was, well, what happens should there be a vacancy between the time of the election? How do we want to handle that? And somebody would have suggested, well, even though the terms are for 4 years, that's if you're elected. If you're appointed, you shouldn't have a 4-year term. It should only be 2. It probably would have passed with little dissent. But because it happens in a time of crisis and a time of tragedy, the politics gets brought to the forward. But I think if Madigan really would want to stick it to Rauner, he probably would have passed the minimum wage.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I think if he'd passed the minimum wage, I think they would have left the income tax increase in place, would not have let that sunset. There are a lot of other ways he could have done this. So this is, I don't think this is any major slight. I mean, it makes perfect sense that, we are going to have an election in 2016 anyway, so why not just have this be a part of it?
Well, with the new governor coming in, we will, of course, be saying goodbye to the current governor. I wanted to take some time at the end of the show here to chat a little bit about Pat Quinn's legacy. Charlie, your thoughts on how Pat Quinn is being viewed as he's leaving office, and also how he might be seen down the road once some time has passed and people look back at the things that happened while he was governor.
I look at Pat Quinn as being a decent, honorable guy who really does care about the little person and who's really interested in social justice issues. I don't think he was a very good administrator. I think he kept some of Rod Blagojevich's deadwood around too long. And I think he did some political stuff at the end of his tenure that maybe tarnishes his reputation somewhat. He excuse me, he came in as kind of an outsider, and he's sort of leaving that way too. But I think in balance, he was exactly what the state needed in those few months after the trauma of getting rid of Rod Blagojevich. He was a guy who came in, people trusted him. Through the 6 years of Rod Blagojevich, we didn't have a capital program because the legislative leaders on both sides of the aisle thought the guy was a bloody liar. And if I'm a legislator, I'm going to vote to raise taxes, and it's because Governor Bob said we're going to take care of that leaky roof on the high school gym. I want to know that I can go home and say we're going to get that gym roof fixed and that you're going to follow through on it. They didn't have that feeling with Blagojevich. They did with Quinn. And I think that's a big thing. He brought honor back to the office. Now, he did some stuff like at DOT with the hiring. I don't think that was good. I think they screwed up the Department of Corrections with the early release. I think they made what anybody would have told him was probably not a good decision when you put this neighborhood recovery initiative program into Chicago and say, well, let the aldermen say where the money's going to go. I mean, that has red flags all over it. But look at the things that happened on his watch. And we were talking about this earlier, stuff like same-sex marriage, stuff like abolition of the death penalty, a couple of really, really big ones. Pension reform. Now, I believe that Senate Bill 1 is unconstitutional, but I think looking at Senate Bill 1 overshadows the fact that a couple of years earlier they put in major monumental changes for new hires that has reduced already the liability of the state going forward. So there's a lot there I think he can be proud of. Now people will say, oh, Pat Quinn, he really was immaterial. He really didn't get these things done. They happened on his watch. On the other hand, he's the guy who signed them. And just take, for example, same-sex marriage. During the campaign, Bruce Rauner said, I would not have signed that bill. So I think Quinn can claim that stuff as part of his legacy.
Bob, thoughts on the Quinn legacy?
Well, the legacy is that people all of a sudden decided that the lieutenant governor maybe wasn't a throwaway office after all, because he did ascend to the governorship after a guy who, started off, as the ultimate outsider with the Citizens Utility Board. I mean, going all the way back to that, and then he worked his way up the food chain, and then was lieutenant governor. And then, because of the Blagojevich mess, he ended up there. And again, he was the guy who, as Charlie said, he was seen as this guy is going to work for you. Pat Quinn's going to work for the little guy. Whether he's in a mine in Southern Illinois, a factory in Quincy, or he's a beat cop in Chicago. But then along the way, Charlie brought up a couple of things. When you had, the IDOT hiring situation, you had the neighborhood recovery program. I think those really did tarnish a lot of the, people just came across as this guy. Pat Quinn wouldn't do that. Well, he ended up getting involved in it. We don't know the extent yet, but still, those things did happen on his watch. But again, there were a couple of tent pole issues that Charlie discussed that did get done. And yeah, he gets the credit because he was the governor. It's not timing. It's not, hey, I just happened to be sitting there. We didn't have a capital plan for however many years. And then, he did get the death penalty abolished and did get same-sex marriage done. So he did get some things accomplished. And he also, he went out, he ran for governor, after he was governor, he won one and then he lost one. So,
I hate to cut you off, but we're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests, Bob, Charlie, thanks for being here. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.